Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is playwright Ken Ludwig. His Ken Ludwig's Dear Jack, Dear Louise is running now at New York's 59E59 theaters. Playbill says Ken Ludwig may be the most performed playwright of his generation. He's had 6 productions on Broadway and 8 in London's West End. His 34 plays and musicals are staged throughout the U.S. and around the world every night of the week. It's quality as well as quantity with Ken. He's won Tony Awards for his Lend Me a Tenor and Crazy for You, countless other awards unique to theater communities, and one for his best-selling book, How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare. I want to talk with Ken about his approach to writing, but I'm still in the glow of Dear Jack, Dear Louise, which confirms his genius for distinctive storytelling. Jack and Louise are Ken's parents, and the play is their story, how they met by exchanging letters during World War II. Those letters reveal not only the characters' personalities and ambitions, but also a time in our country's history. What began as a long-distance meet-cute story becomes something else as the play unfolds. I'm eager to hear how Ken conceived it and wrote it. Ken Ludwig, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you.
Ken, it seems you were set on becoming a playwright from an early age. Is that a safe assumption?
It is. It's absolutely true. I wanted to be a playwright from the very beginning.
Maybe you hedged, I don't know, but in college you studied music theory, but also Shakespeare. At Harvard you studied with Leonard Bernstein, but you also earned a JD degree. Did you ever have any intention of being a lawyer?
Not per se. It was the usual story. I grew up in a very, very nice family who you've met through the play. Right. When I finished high school, I went to college, and after college, my parents said, well, what are you going to do now? And I said, well, I want to go into the theater, as you know. And they said, well, but what are you going to do to earn a living? We didn't have any money at hand. I couldn't live without a job of some sort. And they said, you can't go in the theater. It's too hard to make a living. You need something to back you up. You need to go to some kind of graduate school and get a trade. And so I being a nice boy, but also I think doing the right thing, said, okay, let me apply. And I applied to somewhere, and I got into law school, and I went to law school. And during law school, I got a scholarship to go to Cambridge. I was at Cambridge and did a degree there, and then came out of all that and still wanted to be a playwright, but had no money. So I wrote early in the mornings, wrote plays very early from 4:30 to 8:30 every day religiously, and then trotted off to the law firm to earn a living and I did that for, I don't know how many years, but a few.
And those plays that you were working on early in the morning, were either of them Sullivan and Gilbert or Postmortem?
Sullivan and Gilbert was one. Well done. And did you mention another name? I didn't understand what you said.
Postmortem?
Yes. Postmortem was an early version of a story about which one was Postmortem? Postmortem was a mystery of some kind. I was thinking of another one I wrote as a youngster, which was Abelard and Eloise, that had a different name too. It was Divine Fire, and that actually got as far as being done in New York. Those black box theaters on 42nd Street, they may not still exist. It was the Fairbanks, and there were 3 right in a row, and it was done in DC. All my first efforts, I lived in DC then, as I still do now. All my first efforts were, done in church basements. You know how you have to start, you write. And this was a church basement play, and there were 2 lovely women from New York City who were producing it in DC in this church basement. And this Abelard and Eloise play they liked, and they got it to New York, which was really a real off-Broadway site. We got a little a nice in the New York Times, in the back of the art section, a little short review they used to do, and it was very complimentary, and it ran for its allotted time. So that was the most exciting thing that happened. to me. And then I had my next church basement play. And then I had DeSullivan and Gilbert, which the Kennedy Center produced along with the National Theatre of Canada. It was a co-production. So I was up in Ottawa getting it built and ready. And then I wrote Lend Me a Tenor. And then that changed my life.
Yeah. Ken, is this the equivalent of somebody struggling to write their first novel, and to their surprise, it gets published, well reviewed, leading to a bestseller? The reason I ask is I don't know, is this a usual arc for a playwright, or did you demonstrate a level of skill very early on that attracted people to your work?
Well, that's very nice of you to put it that way. I don't know. I lived through it, and it's a great metaphor you just used that I never thought of. But I think we all have to learn our craft. If you're going to be a real honest to goodness writer, you have to work at it the way you work at anything else. In a sense, that's why the law wasn't such a bad thing. If it taught me anything, it was how to focus and accomplish something and pass those very difficult exams. And you can't do it without concentrated work. And it's the same thing being a writer. It doesn't, you can't just dash off something and suddenly you become a superstar because you have such immense talent. You work and you work and you work and you work. And then it looks like you dashed off something new, but it's because you've got so much behind you.
Yeah. How does a playwright describe chops? I mean, that is what does a playwright need to do well to get his story across?
Well, George Bernard Shaw has an interesting essay where he says, because so many people would write to him and say, how can I become a playwright? And his answer in his essay is, there's nothing you really can do. Either you're a playwright or you aren't. Either you can hear the world through that oral, AURL, oral lens, or you don't. You then can become better and better and better at it by working really hard and reading a lot and seeing things. But it's you either have that or you don't. And I do believe that with all my heart. If you don't have that talent to see the play whole as you're sitting in your chair with your pencil in your hand, or if you have it, you have it, and you don't, you don't. If you do, you then cultivate it. And I think that was my one and only talent in life, was to understand plays because I loved them so much and read so many and went to so many.
Yeah. Do you think there's some component of genetics involved in this, as depicted in Dear Jack and Dear Louise? Your mom was so passionate about musical theater. She was an actress and a showgirl. How did she share that passion with you?
Well, I think that's a very good point too. It maybe your circumstances as you grew up. She shared it because when we were youngsters, her family lived in Brooklyn, still lived in Brooklyn when I was a youngster. I have a brother, and the two of us are still best friends in the entire world. And we would go once a year to Brooklyn to visit her parents, my grandparents. He was a tailor. She simply raised her two children. My mother had a sister, and my parents would take my brother and I to see a show in New York every year. Once a year, we saw a show in New York, and that's one of the things that opened my eyes to wanting to be in the theater because I was so dazzled. It's like all the stories. I had dinner last night with a bunch of the actors in my show I'm working on right now, and we all have similar stories in that somewhere along the line we go, oh my God, this is either so glamorous or so intellectually challenging. We just want to do it. And that's what opened my eyes to wanting to be in the theater. And the second thing my parents did was they bought me a copy of Richard Burton's Hamlet, the LPs, and
Ah.
for my birthday, for my 10th birthday. And I just listened and listened and listened. I truly wore it out. And since then, now you can listen on streaming services, and you can also, there's a video. It's not an old video. They did it for consumption, but it was in those days. It's not beautiful to look at, but Richard Burton with John Gielgud playing the ghost, John Gielgud directing. Oh, a terrific cast. There have been books written about it. It was one of the great productions of all time, and I spent hours and hours. I mean, tens, dozens, hundreds of hours listening to it. I was just so mesmerized.
Did you have a notebook with sketches in it, little exchanges of dialogue, or this depictions of stage settings and things like that?
Absolutely, because I was so voracious a reader. So I'd read about Ellen Terry, one of my heroes, and her son was a very famous set designer, and I'd look at his. So, and I write longhand, and I only write longhand. So I do have books, and what they are were separate pads of paper. I've sort of kept everything.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of the young writer who is making little sketches and suddenly realizes, wait a second, I'm actually growing here. I'm developing some craft.
Huh.
I mean, at what age and this is not a statement of ego, at what age did you say, I might actually be good at this?
Well, this is a horrible answer to that, because it sounds terrible. Is I never thought about that. I always said, this is what I can do. I'm going to do it. And I never had any doubts, and I just kept doing it.
Wow. So what's the editing process like when we write our novels and short fictions? Sometimes we cut our best prose because it doesn't serve the story. What's the playwright equivalent of that?
Yeah, you have to sacrifice your baby sometimes to make the whole thing survive. Absolutely. I'm in the middle of that right now. I'm right now down at the wonderful Oslo Theater in Sarasota, where a play of mine is having its world premiere. And we're in the middle of previews right now. So every day I'm in there working with the cast, rehearsals all day, see it in the evenings, and then make changes. I make changes up to the opening of the world premiere of sort of the definitive production, be it on Broadway or on the West End or the first big regional production. And this is definitive. This is maybe the best production I ever had. And so I work on the play all the time until the opening. And then and usually by that time I go, that's it. That's the best I can make it. And now I'll move on to the next piece.
I see. Can we talk a little bit about Dear Jack and Dear Louise? I know the listeners at a disadvantage having not seen it, but I have to say I found it a remarkable bit of storytelling. Um,
Thank you.
I don't know, Ken, that there's a word out of place in that play. What was the genesis of that play?
Well, I I write two plays a year, and I'm very and I write all the time. I write virtually every day of the year, except if I'm really away, or I'm writing when I'm in a situation like now, opening Lady Molly of Scotland Yard. But in terms of the new work, it's when I sit down in my study with a pencil in my hand, which is usually a pen, but in my hand, and I start writing. Um, I just think about what are the stories I could tell that would be effective on a theater. I often don't know what the next one's going to be till I sit down and do it. Sometimes I'm walking around my library at home, and I have, as we all do who love this stuff, have hundreds thousands of books, and I go, oh, that book catches my eye. I haven't reread that story. I haven't thought about that issue. In this case, Dear Jack and Dear Louise. I was always an admirer of Pete A.R. Gurney's love letters. And I thought, my plays, because I had just done, I started out writing comedies, only comedies, because it's what I love. The great history of classic English comedy, a comedy in the English language from Shakespeare on. And those plays tend to have a large canvas. And I thought somewhat specifically that it would be interesting to write something for two people. And the only people I know well enough to write about would be my parents. So I just started thinking about what would a play look like. And I knew, and I was very close to my parents, they've passed away. And I knew the story completely true, that my mother wanted to be in show business. It was in Brooklyn, New York, typical sort of situation, wanted to be a showgirl, went to one of those boarding houses with other wannabe show business people, and was apparently, when I thought it through, must have been taking tap dancing lessons and singing lessons, just like all the actors I see around me now every day of my life. I had never thought of that until I started writing the play. And then there was my father, who had just been drafted into the Army in World War II. He had just finished medical school. He had put himself through medical school. And there he was, 3,000 miles away. And they met because one father, the two fathers must obviously knew each other, my dad's father and my mother's father. And we don't know how. Did they come over on the same boat from Eastern Europe? Did they meet when they were in America? We don't know. But somewhere along the line, one said, I got a beautiful daughter. Your son should meet her. And the other one said, it's nothing compared to my son. Your daughter would be lucky to meet my son. So they somehow gave them their addresses. My dad in Medford, Oregon, my mom in Brooklyn, and they started writing letters. And I knew about them since I was a kid, but I never saw any of them. I knew mom had them in a box, and she destroyed them before she died, because we don't know why, my brother and I. This is as close a family as you can imagine. But I think it must have been that she felt they had a certain intimacy, which they would. These people, mom was 21 years old. My dad was late 20s. He was 30. There's a 9-year difference in their ages, in truth. They must have been intimate in a way that my mother didn't want her boys to see. So I made up the letters from scratch.
You did?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Before we continue with the play, I just want to go back to something that you said. You're in your study, surrounded by books. You have a thought, this could be interesting. And then you realize it is interesting. Isn't that a wonderful moment, Ken, when that happens?
It sure is. It sure is. You get this little thread. You get thread of an idea, and you coax it out, but you can't pull on it or it might break. Sometimes I just kind of have to look away or go take a walk because I'm so close to a good idea. I'm going to lose it. And I can't even write it down sometimes because making it that concrete makes it too. I've then eliminated other possibilities for that little thread. You just coax it along.
Yeah. So anyway, getting back to the play, Ken, on the surface, these are stock characters. You've got the doctor in the army, far away from the bright, shining potential Broadway star. However, they minute by minute, and sometimes second by second, they become more distinctive, more fully formed, richer. How did you do your research into the depth of both of your parents?
Well, in this case, I didn't. I had the luxury of knowing them better than I knew anyone else in the world except my brother. And they're part of me. And I told their story. That is exactly my parents. There is nothing fictional in the play. There's a little taradiddle maybe here and there. I don't know. I know that they met. Mom met his parents while she was still on the East Coast, because they were all on the East Coast. My father was indeed in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, when he started, a little town west of Philadelphia, and Dad was way 3,000 miles away. So all Aunt Betty is true. Everything in it is true. It's coaxed a little bit, of course, to give it clarity. The stories are condensed a little bit. The visit my mom's first visit to meet her, what would become her in-laws. She's from Brooklyn, and she comes to little Coatesville, Pennsylvania. In writing this, I did visit Coatesville again after all this time, because I had visited my grandparents, and it is a steel town. My dad did indeed work in steel mills. It's called Lucan's Steel. It's been out of business for quite a while. So I just tootled around. It's now, not the cute town that I am. Maybe it never was, because it was in my imagination what it was. It's now sort of having hard times, as so many small towns have been. I wrote this in 2019, I guess, so it's not that long, 5 years ago, and so I didn't do any research, and there wasn't any to be had. As I say, my mom destroyed the letters. It was not a time, my parents weren't literary per se, so they didn't save anything else of theirs per se. My brother has my dad's desk when he practiced medicine, and then in York, Pennsylvania, for the rest of his life, where I grew up. There's certain things I just treasure. I have one little, I wear my dad's watch every day of the year. I'm looking at it right now, an old Seiko that my mom bought him when they were both healthy and well. I treasure things from them. I was really lucky. Fact is, I had this wonderful childhood, and I loved my parents, and they were always kind to me, and I have a wonderful brother. So I was very, very lucky, and I realized, reading stories and these times of distress we're having and so on, that and my latest play, this lady, no, it's not my latest, but the one's being produced now, Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, set during World War II, which has parallels to the pandemic and to our own world of contention. But Dear Jack, Dear Louise did not. It was a story of a different time that didn't feel at the time fraught with darkness. Of course, it's set during World War II. Of course, he has to go fight the war as a doctor, and those are harrowing things. But I didn't depict them in Dear Jack, Dear Louise in a way that makes our blood curdle. You don't see graphic scenes of violence. You live it through their minds.
Yeah. You achieve, for the novelist, setting is all. And so when we meet your parents, the setting is very, very sparse, but through language of the letters, their worlds become increasingly vivid to us. I'm fascinated by, how do you write without setting? What you're doing as the writer is you're creating setting in our minds through the use of language. I bet you 5 years from now, if people ask me about that play, I will describe it using things I did not see, but that you conveyed through language.
Thank you.
No,
I do. Appreciate it. I just try to be as honest and as having read these hundreds, thousands of plays that I love from Shakespeare on, in the world of I'll call it drama in the great march of comic plays from Shakespeare on in classical plays in the English language, from Shakespeare to the Restoration, Wycherley and Congreve, and then to the late Restoration of the great George Fark, Barbot's Stratagem, and the Recruiting Officer, and then there's one or two oddballs, Buccico's London Assurance, a great comic play in the 1730s, and then you get to the flowering of great comic plays in the 1775, all clustered around there, which is Goldsmith, She Stoops to Conquer, and Sheridan's The Rival, and School for Scandal, and then O'Keeffe's Wild Oats, and then you move into the 19th century. Things, the history of great comic theater in the English language goes fallow at times for 30, 40, 50 years at a time. So after She Stoops and that flowering period in the late 18th century, it goes quiet. And then you get it again in Noel Coward, the Arthur Wing Pinero, the first playwright who was ever knighted. He was a great, wonderful comic playwright. Dandy Dick, the Magistrate, the Cabinet Minister, the School Mistress. Wonderful plays, and then you move into Coward and Wilde, and then you get into in America, Kaufman and Hart, and to the present day. And that's so much part of what I think about every single day of my life. I thought about my parents, about their history, their story, if through that lens of it is a romantic comedy, but not told as, trying to get laugh per laugh, as a lot of my plays do. It was meant to be a heartfelt comedy, because that's what I think about every day of my life.
Yeah. Without giving too much away, Jack breaks an unspoken vow to Louise. The revelation absolutely works as drama, but as a son, did you question whether to reveal it?
I did. That's very perceptive of you. That's no one has ever mentioned that before to me, and I did indeed, because he's such a good guy. But don't. But the answer is, these days kids will say, "Oh, I'm going with somebody. Oh my gosh, I couldn't go out with anybody else." And they're not engaged, they're not this, they're not that, but that's my boyfriend or girlfriend. That's the new thing that I've seen in the last 10, 20 years, a new little twist on our mating dances. And I don't think that existed then. So it's not something that I'd say. I don't want to give too much away either, but it's not a moment in their relationship where they have already plighted their troth. They are still out in the world. So I didn't think it was something that I would blame him for, ever.
Yeah, and it was resolved beautifully, but not quickly. I really admired the fact that you. I mean, it would have been ludicrous if they had said to each other, "Oh, okay, that's fine." You sort of get them back on track slowly, and we're rooting for them.
Yeah, well, clearly it causes real deep hurt feelings, and those aren't to be dismissed easily. It takes you time to come back on track, and sometimes you say, "I can't do this. I'm so in love. It has hurt me so deeply. I need this wound to heal."
Yes, yes. You alluded to something a few minutes ago. In the play, we see depicted elements of the American character that they may no longer exist in the public at large. And I think in the play, it's more than subtext. Unspoken but unmistakable is your mother's commitment to the war effort and your father's willingness to put his life at risk for the greater good. As you were writing, did those traits shared by so many in the war years seem antiquated or outmoded to you?
No, I don't. And in a sense, that's part of why I wrote the play when I did, because it was written just as the pandemic was welling up. And there were wars all the time, and people with courage just face and do what they have to do. And that's what my parents did, and that's what we did in World War II. And the people who fight for our country and other countries are, if they have convictions about what they're doing, I've never had to do it. So it is something I'm writing about, and therefore maybe I'm being glib because I've never had to face that. There was a draft. My number came up that I didn't need to go in the army, but that was a chance thing. But I would have gone and served because that was a duty I had, and I I I admire them deeply for it. But so many of us in this country, and I can't speak for anywhere else, but I'm sure everywhere else, where they feel strongly about their way of life and their form of a form of democracy. If you need to roll up your sleeves, it's frightening as the dickens. The play I'm writing right now, called Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, that opens on Friday, is also set in World War II. I'm a big World War II buff, and I read about Churchill all the time. He's my hero, and as I think I make clear in the play, the heroes in my life are my parents and my brother. But in terms of outward looking, he's my hero. And this play really hits that. Are you going to sacrifice to go out? Are you going to sacrifice your life and go out and defend, in this case, England, from the bombings? It begins during the Blitz, and show that courage to go out and fight what you recognize is an evil. There's no clearer example in our lives, in our century, and probably in the past several centuries, of sheer evil than the Nazi rise to power. And you had to put your life on the line, and if you did, you did.
Ken, one last question. Has the play taken on new meaning for you since it was first produced?
It has, because I've been so fortunate that people have come to me as they see it, as it is being done around the country now, around the world, that people come to me really moved by it in a way that my plays, I've been lucky, that, immensely lucky. And I have plays done all over the world all the time. And they're comedies. I'm trying to be, as I said, into that tradition of classic English comedy. But I never did anything that went as deeply as this into my own life. And the fact that what happened in my own life really has touched these people, and people come up to me all the time. It's shocking, and say, oh, gee, we love this play, we just saw it, but our favorite is Dear Jack, Dear Louise.
Isn't that so satisfying?
Yeah.
I've been speaking with Ken Ludwig, a writer of enormous talent and singular talent of our generation. Ken, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Writers at Work.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.